over the years, we've built a lot and developed a lot of housing. OMH has 40,000 units, right, alone. And we have HASA housing, we have HRA housing, we have OPWDD housing, we have, I mean, as Liz was pointing, we have HCR housing, we had HP, you know. And yet, and many of these housing came from great bargains, right? New York 1, 2, 3, you know, now we're talking about something much broader. Yet, the world's changed, people have changed, we've learned a lot, and yet, in some instances, we're trying to both reconfigure the past and move to the the present. And we have lots of housing, and while MRT is focused on high Medicaid users, I would throw out the question, and notwithstanding federal requirements and all these qualifications, if you got to be this to be in there and this to do that, and that is, how do we think about, and I don't know there's an answer to this question, but how do we think about opening up the existing housing in ways that are different, or do we, or can we, to really start looking at the needs going forward as opposed to what we developed over those years, which are all good, and they still exist, but we don't always have access to them at the right points in time when people need them because they've got all of these restrictions. So I'm throwing that out to the panel, knowing that's not like a slam dunk answer here, but just ways of thinking about that, or how should we be thinking about that?
Well, I can talk about, you've heard me talk over the last couple of years about what we call housing redesign. And there are a number of agencies, probably about 30 statewide, that I can confidently say have really looked at their housing stock, their housing programs, and said, how can I do this different? How does it meet my county's needs, my agency's needs, the consumer's needs in the community? And how can I reconfigure them? Agencies have taken their traditional 24-hour supervised community residence and closed it, turned it into supported treatment apartments, and in some cases supported apartments. They've created mixed-use programs. So they're looking a little differently, and this is in the last few years. And now the phone calls that I'm receiving are, how can I take that existing community residence and meet the crisis needs of individuals? So we have received some ideas, papers, of concepts on what individual agencies would like to do to really meet those changing needs. And we're not sure exactly how that's going to fit in, but certainly looking at that and thinking about the 1959, thinking about HARP eligibility and sustainability as we go forward, has put a whole element of ideas on the table that we didn't have before. So I think people are being creative out there with what they have, and I welcome any conversation you want to have about doing something different. We should have the conversation, because it might not be that exact idea, but you're in the streets doing this. You know what the needs are, and we have to have conversations about the changes that are necessary, not just with MRT, but with any kind of housing that's out there. What are the future needs of the folks you're serving today?
Anyone else want, Liz?
Sure, I'll give you my thoughts, and since I'm new, I think it's easy for me to say, and most folks think I'm crazy when I throw out new ideas, but I'll just tell you what I've seen being new to the table is, when you talk to folks about housing in New York, the first thing they say is it's complicated. It's different in the city, it's different upstate, and it's different by the population that you serve. And so, I think in an ideal world, what I would like to see is, right now, if there's an available unit, but someone is on a waiting list, but they don't have HIV/AIDS, but that unit's only for HIV/AIDS. Or, there's a waiting list, but there's units available, but that person doesn't fit that diagnosis, and so you can't place them there. And so I think the future is how do we simplify it, broaden the populations, and to the extent there's available units, how do we creatively think about how to move folks who need it into housing quicker and better. And that's just something that I think is worth a conversation moving forward.
I would just say that, partly, what in the presentation I gave, thank you. In the presentation I gave, we didn't really think about this when we started taking chronically homeless people beginning in 2007 from the street, but we were taking the MRT folks right off the street, and so you could continue to do that today, where you could take, existing units that you have for homeless people, and you could take in, if you take in chronically homeless people from the street, you're likely to get MRT people, and be able to respect the use of the, if the unit was built by HPD, for instance, and it's designated for homeless people, you sort of like the two birds with one stone. And then the other is, I would just say, and I know this is a sacred MRT workshop here, but these days you can't really go anywhere in a meeting without somebody saying MRT, and it is an extremely important issue. But there are also lots of other people who need housing too, like youth aging out of foster care, families with a mentally ill parent, and so forth. And so somehow we have to keep our eye on the big, on the wide-angle view, recognizing that this particular group has been, sorely underserved, but figuring out how to bring them into the mix in a responsible way.
But yeah, I just want to go back to Liz's point also that, I think we find ourselves in that situation where we sometimes have people stuck because we're focused on the future, it's MRT, and yet if we only had that, we could move that person. And I like the idea of sort of, I'm sure, how many people out there would sort of welcome that they feel, for people who are doing housing, that they know that there's just too many limits on the different opportunities, and people kind of get stuck in place, right? Right? So it's sort of like, if we could open that dialogue up, yeah, and kind of blow it out. Now, understanding that, again, we have, HUD's in the middle of this, and Olmsted's in the middle of this, and it's not like we're completely independent agents in New York State. But it's a great conversation. And it gets to Tony's point, I think, also, about, the folks who are MRT qualified and not. And I guess one of the questions around MRT in particular, because we get into this issue of prevention, there's the pyramid, right? 5% of the high users, 15% and the rest. But they move around. People move around, right? So how do we get at it? What's the vision? And I think there is one, by the way. What's the vision for New York in terms of prevention and housing as prevention for people who may not qualify because at this point they're not high users of the system, but are maybe about to be or potentially? And how do we address that? Is there any thinking along that line with respect to housing in particular?
Sure, I can start it off and then hand it off to my colleagues. But prevention is another key piece that we're looking at, is how do we keep individuals who are currently housed in their house for as long as possible. And so we have been exploring that with the MRT. The first population that comes to mind is the senior population. Low-income seniors currently in HUD 202 facilities. How do we provide modest supports, whether it's transportation, basic home modifications, and certain supports that those folks need to make sure that they can remain in their current house for as long as possible without needing costly nursing home care, and we think that that's a smart investment. So we're brainstorming. I think we've only just begun. I think there are tons of populations and prevention activities that we can look at, but that's one piece that comes to mind, that we currently have a pilot that we're working on to fund senior supportive housing.
Prevention's tough, I think, because prevention's prediction, right? So you're predicting, and so prediction's always tough, and so. I think the further out you go in terms of trying to prevent it, the more expensive it gets, because everybody you're predicting something would happen to, it doesn't happen to. But you can certainly do it like we do it, in the home base program. Somebody comes in, they have an eviction notice, then they're likely they're going to become homeless. And if you have high blood pressure, that could result in a stroke, or high blood sugar level, diabetes. And so so if there's something there, if there are warning signs, then I think those could be addressed in a lot better ways than we're currently doing it. Certainly for this population, around avoiding high cost institutional care later down the road.